Hi.
Hello. Good, Daphne.
Yeah, hi.
Hello. Hello.
Nice to meet you. How are you today?
I'm well, and how are you?
I'm good. Yeah, I'm excited to speak about this with you.
Good, good, Daphne.
Should we kind of jump right into it and
Right,
like
do let's do.
kind of have our give some meat, some literature meat to our listeners?
Yes, yes,
Um,
do let's. And I'm very happy to answer any questions you might have. But thinking about the subject of
yeah.
research, um, just before we
Yeah.
connected, um, there was one thing that has been with me for a long time. It was many years ago, perhaps 15 years ago, that a practicing biographer here in Oxford called Humphrey Carpenter Lassie's, he's no longer alive, but he was the biographer of Auden and Pound and Benjamin Britten. And he had a hand in some, he had a deadline for some kind of article he had to contribute to a book, and he didn't have the patience to write the article. So he said to me, if you just interview me, he was very eloquent and worked otherwise also for the BBC. He
Yeah.
said, I'll just answer your questions about biography, and then I'll have my article, which, as it happened, was true. And we got talking about research, and
Yeah.
he said to me something I've always remembered as absolutely true. He said that you have to go to an archive with a prepared mind. And unless you go with questions in your mind, I remember his exact words. He said, you will get seriously unstuck. And what he meant was that it's true that when you go to an archive in a special collections, you are presented with a huge array of sometimes unsifted papers, sometimes they've been catalogued, but
Yeah.
you just it's overwhelming. And unless you come to the archive with already questions in your mind, you won't know where to start. I mean, I don't know if that is just all too obvious. When Humphrey said that to me, I was already a practicing biographer, and I thought back to when I was a student at Columbia, and my first book grew out of my dissertation on T.S. Eliot's early years, and I went to the archive, which was at the New York Public Library, in the Burr collection on the top
Yeah.
floor. And I did have a question in my mind, which was, at what point did Eliot's religious life start? And um, what I was present, what I was given, what I asked for were his early papers. They were not then published, and the answer was actually loud and clear that he converted halfway through his life. In 1927, he became a Christian convert, but actually he was thinking about religion. It was clear from his poems, his unpublished poems, um, and little scribbles, that he was thinking about it when he was a graduate student at Harvard in in 1912, 1913, 1914. So that
Yeah.
became the very heart of my thesis. And it was terribly lucky that the archive yielded a really overwhelmingly clear answer
Yeah.
to the question that was in my mind. Not
Yeah.
that, not that when I published the book in 1977, people accepted it necessarily.
Yeah.
Some people accepted it. But when you present something new as a result of archival work, I'm afraid that one has to expect a certain amount of resistance. I think that's just always true, that when people
Yeah.
were stuck in established paradigms, because the paradigm for Eliot's life at that point was that there was a very sophisticated, um, a satiric, um, man about town kind of poet, modernist,
Yeah.
very experimental modernist. And then come 1927, and a lever got thrown, and after that he was a religious poet. It
Right.
was a very simple paradigm, but that's what I was taught. And also I was taught that he was an impersonal poet and that he gave out. And what those papers revealed was that there was quite a lot of his life in his poetry. And that again was going against the archive, really pushed me. Although I was just one of a myriad graduate students, I felt that it was okay in the dissertation to express the findings. It took more courage to publish it, as a form of a book, because then it took a long time for people to see that Eliot's life and work were actually quite close. So I'm giving you just my own particular experience moving from being a student into publication. But fortunately, I had at Columbia, I didn't have any trouble at the defense. There was a man, Jacques Bazin, a professor, who was very supportive. One of their he was an internal examiner, and there was a theologian from Union Theological Seminary. I was really went into the defense scared of him. I mean, thinking, what do I know about theology? I'm not even a Christian. My background is Jewish. But I mean, I was very interested in the spiritual journey and Eliot's poetry, and that theologian couldn't have been kinder. But I'm just trying to say that an archive tells you, well, you're very much closer. I can't say that the archive will tell you the whole truth, because sometimes archives can be constructed. I'm thinking of, for instance, off the top of my head, how Henry James, just before his last illness, had bonfires. He burnt a lot of his papers. In other words, although there's a massive archive at Harvard, you've got to be aware too that an archive can be constructed. If the author has been very wary of posthumous power, because you see, once an author is dead, the biographer or the critic is free to explore the material and use it. Sometimes there are obstacles, like in the face of publication. And that's another issue. But I don't know if I've launched out on a subject that is relevant.
No, definitely. We're definitely going to get into that. I want to, definitely, 100%. I want to hear a little bit about what first interested you in writing biographies.
Oh, well, unlike many people, more talented people, gifted people, I didn't expect to be a writer. I just was following through as a graduate student, where I'm originally South African, and for political reasons, I left South Africa and landed in New York. I didn't necessarily choose or expect to be there, but just followed through. American literature seemed obvious to study. I didn't expect to be a writer. So just tell me your question again and see what
why biographies? What first interested you in
yes.
biography?
I find that really a hard question to answer.
Yeah, no, definitely.
I feel that I wouldn't, if I'd been here at Oxford as a graduate student, I don't think I would have been allowed to do a biographical thesis, not in the 70s. It wasn't allowed then. I remember other people telling me when I came to Oxford, I was really, fortunately, Columbia didn't question it. And I think it really came, the idea of being a biographer really happened in the course of writing, of doing research for my dissertation, as I came to see, looking at Eliot's papers, that I was interested in his life, and I read a book that may not be around anymore, but it was an excellent book, published in 1965, called Notes on Some Figures behind T.S. Eliot. And it was a very biographical book. And so I really owe it to that man, Herbert Howarth, who wrote that book, to make some links between Eliot but he called it very modestly Notes on Some Figures behind Eliot. And as I did the research, it was borne on me more and more that this was not just a personal poet, that he wasn't impersonal at all, but he might even be a confessional poet. Wow. And, there's a very strong vein of confession in American literature. And I began to see Eliot as coming more and more, partly perhaps because I had, before my dissertation, specialized in American literature, especially 19th century American literature, which was very well taught at Columbia at that time, with Sack van Berkowitz, who later went to Harvard. Who specialized in the Puritan period. And I went to speak to Professor Berkowitz, who became my supervisor. I was his first graduate student. And although he wasn't an Eliot specialist, he was very supportive of my, but then it was just a notion that Eliot had strong imaginative links with American Puritans, with the New England Puritans. And as I began to read more of Eliot's letters, which at those days were scattered all over the place, they're now increasingly collected, but they're still being collected so many years after. But he does tell special friends, like Pound, like Geoffrey Faber, with whom he, collaborated in founding Faber and Faber. He did confide to them of his emotional ties with the introspectiveness, the moral rigor, the seriousness of the American Puritans. And there's a very strong vein I learned from Saki Berkowitz. There's a strong vein in the American Puritans of public confession. Like they had to take their moral pulse and speak out in public, hoping that they had been preordained to be saved. So there was so much. All this sort of contributed gradually to my sense that I was writing a strongly biographical thesis.
Right.
And I suppose that, and then once I'd done that, certainly Dame Helen, I'm talking about Helen Gardner, when I got here to Oxford, she didn't object. She too was very interested in the spiritual search. And so it was largely through Dame Helen the book got published. She just took it into Oxford University Press and just said, do it.
Wow.
It wasn't sent out as normally academic presses send books out to readers. And I couldn't have told, Daphne, because many people didn't believe what I was putting forward. But you published it, and then I had another very good. I met a very good man, John Strawworthy, a poet who was my editor. Later, he became professor in upstate New York at Cornell. So he was also a supportive editor, though I was very shy of him because he had such sort of very beautiful English manners. I didn't know, how to respond. Anyway, I think that once I'd written a biographical thesis, it wasn't called a biography, it was called Eliot's Early Years. I'd sort of got very keen on writing biography and was deeply influenced by Eliot, by certain ways he had of looking at lives. He said, I think this is in Four Quartets, something about the inner life. Our lives are driven by what is inward. I'm not quoting him now. This is just a paraphrase. But it implies that the external events of a life are peripheral to the inward story.
Right.
And that was crucial for a confessional poet. And after Eliot, actually, while I was in the archives and in the Burr collection in the New York Public Library, Virginia Woolf's diaries and other papers had just been acquired by the same library. They were there, they were not yet published. And I'm such a fan of Virginia Woolf. I couldn't help just dropping the Eliot work, and I would deviate and read avidly in Virginia Woolf's diaries. Luckily, both Eliot and Virginia Woolf had handwriting that was really easy to read.
That's good.
That was good because, of course, in some archives you can come across incredibly difficult hands. So what I read in Virginia Woolf sort of impelled me towards the writer's life aspect of Virginia Woolf. You know, Leonard Woolf first published her diaries as a writer's diary.
Yeah, the writer's life. Yeah.
So I wrote a writer's life. So that she had a very similar. She and Eliot, of course, were very close. Virginia Woolf and her husband Leonard, you probably know, were Eliot's editors at the Hogarth Press and published The Wasteland and his second volume of poems 1919. So but they didn't actually overtly talk about writing, and yet I believe they were doing something very similar in the form of what a life is. Both of them put an emphasis on moments, what Virginia Woolf called moments of being, and Eliot called the unattended moment. Even their phrases are very close. And that became very formative for me. I was actually very affected by the subjects I chose, or I chose subjects because of the kind of biography I wanted to write. So what I'm saying, Daphne, is that I haven't written standard biography. I'm not writing the voluminous, all-inclusive tome. So that could be complementary to what I'm doing. I'm not saying I'm against the tome. It's accumulation of fact, but that I'm really interested in. Well, I think that a biographer has to ask him or herself, what story do I want to tell? And I'm really interested in the narrative drive.
Yeah.
Most academic writing, I'm sorry to say, doesn't have narrative drive.
True.
And, I feel that if you're doing research as a graduate and aiming for publication, you do have to ask yourself, what story do I want to tell, and have a narrative drive, because just an accumulation of factual detail is not going to be enough to engage readers.
That leads perfectly into something I wanted to ask about your biography on Eliot. And I'm just going to read out the description for the book for everyone. It reads as follows. So, a hidden Eliot emerges through both sides of the unsealed Hale correspondence, seen also through the eyes of other spirited women who lent themselves to his life and art. Vivienne, the flamboyant wife with whom he shared a private wasteland, Mary Trevelyan, his companion in prayer, and Valerie Fletcher, the young disciple to whom he proposed when his second chance with Emily floundered. Though Eliot kept his women apart, they spurred his transformations as expatriate, convert, and finally a man made for love.
Yes.
And I love that description. I think it really encompasses a very particular picture of Eliot as a person, kind of like what you were just saying. And so that literally leads right into my question about, I was just thinking about biography and the process of writing biography. And it seems that a large part of it is about painting a particular picture of someone or casting them in a particular mold or light.
That really well. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yes.
Thank you.
Exactly.
So I wanted to ask, how do you decide how you are going to depict that person that you're writing about? Is there an aspect of feeling like you know their essence, or is that not really how the process is for you? Like, how do you decide, like, I got it, it's going to be this kind of Eliot, it's going to be like this? Like, how is that process for you?
I want to be absolutely honest with you. That goes back to when I was a teenager with my mother in Cape Town. My mother was a teaching Bible. She was to women's groups, and she was a very avid reader of poetry, and Eliot in particular. And she had a particular view of Eliot that she just conveyed to me as we read. I began to read Eliot's poetry at school, and it was very much she saw the life in the interstices of the work, and she almost gave me the method very casually as we were reading. I mean, she didn't know huge details about the life, but she was a very good reader, and she sensed how much Eliot's poetry was bound up with his actual experience. Of course, one's also always got to be wary. You can't make a neat equation between life and work. And I don't think my mother meant to, but she did sort of suggest to me that his first marriage was a kind of wasteland. You know, she didn't. I mean, afterwards, Eliot acknowledged that. And so I did have a kind of paradigm from my mother, and I think my mother had the idea that Eliot's idea of the religious life, which I saw, I had an idea of Eliot's life before I went to the archive and found that the archive answered it, which was that although he looked like very complex and difficult on the surface, that there was a kind of single-minded idea running all through his poetry. And as tutor, and I taught Eliot a lot around the university here, I would sort of alert students from the beginning to look for that driving idea behind Eliot's poetry, a kind of single-minded search, a kind of search that culminates in salvation. And that Dante was one guiding light to him, so that he was autobiographical in the way Dante was looking. I would say to my pupils, you don't have to have read Dante to understand that there was no shortcut to paradise, that you had to actually, Dante, the way he expounds this journey is that you have to plummet to the very depths of hell and then climb through all the stairways of purgatory towards paradise. And I think if one understands just that schema, you understand Eliot's poetry, because he was very preoccupied with flaws, with things, because I'm quoting Eliot, things ill done and done to others harm. He felt he had to confront that, like American Puritans did, like Dante. And many people who underwent the religious life. John Donne, in one of his sonnets, said, "Batter my heart, three-person God. You know, unless you enthrall me, never shall be free, nor ever chaste, except you ravish me." It was. These are what William James would call the twice-born in his varieties of religious experience. They have to undergo a process that breaks you down, and then you attempt to rebuild yourself. There's a very different religious temperament in Henry Vaughan, who says, "I saw eternity the other night, like a great ring of pure and endless light." So that's a different narrative. It's somebody who, perhaps Emily Dickinson was like Vaughan, somebody who was by nature a visionary. And that's fascinating in itself. But Eliot, so that the story I had to tell was already laid down for me. Partly it came from my mother's own religious life, because she was on a journey that, although she was Jewish and very devout, She recognized in Eliot a spiritual journey that was very like her own. And when I was teaching Eliot around here in Oxford, I found that those of my students who had some religious background, they didn't have to be religious, but they had some religious background, including students from India who'd often had that kind of background in a different religion. They may, come from, a Hindu or Muslim religion. They seemed quickly to get it.
Yeah.
I'm now wandering back to what is the question? Oh, what empowered me to write biography?
You've definitely answered it. I mean, I think I really understand kind of how you go about trying to capture that person in, because I think it's a really interesting relationship. Like I was gonna say in language, like I think the relationship between personhood and language and how do you depict that through language is such an interesting one. And I think you've definitely like walked me through that process. So no, you've 100% answered the question for sure.
Yes. I mean, Eliot in the quartets, I mean, the last part 5 of each of the quartets is specifically about a struggle to find the right language, that it goes in tandem with the inward moral and spiritual struggle. So it's to find the complete consort dancing together, he says about language. Right. But also in Burnt Norton, the first of the quartets, he's looking for immortality, actually, and he thinks about art and how a Chinese jar still moves through its stillness. He means in time we're moving all the time, but the timeless is his objective, both in terms of the religious search, but also in terms of his own art. And so he looks at this Chinese jar, or imagines this Chinese jar. There was actually a Chinese jar owned by the family of his roommate at Milton Academy in Massachusetts, where he went to school, whose family had a Chinese jar. So it was, you often trace images and you find that
they're everywhere.
They actually were there. I mean, John had his advisor on the quartet said to him, why autumn something or other in the quartets? And he said, but it was autumn. So they're trying to stop it. What he's saying is, okay, well, music is in time while the note lasts, but how do you reach the timeless? And then he says the word with a capital W in the desert. He's striving for language that has the permanence of scripture.
Yeah.
A fantastically ambitious aim. How do you find a language that will outlast time? And he says every poet has to struggle for that. And, if you read a classic and you'll know this, if you read Jane Eyre, if you read any of George Eliot's novels, you see something that speaks to one so directly. You feel almost kinship with this person. There's a special relationship with the writer that every reader feels. And you
definitely.
And how do it's something that can't fully be explained, because other works date almost so quickly. Ordinary books date quickly, and then you feel such closeness to the great classic writers. I don't know how they manage to do it, but there's something. Sometimes it's very intimate, like Jane Eyre saying, "Reader, I married him." You feel you're listening to a confession.
It is so true. I love that phrase. I love it. I love that phrase of that you want to find a language that outlasts time. I think that is absolutely beautiful. And I think that is why we all study English, I think, because
But how to get there? How do we get there? I mean, or ourselves. I mean, if we want to write something that is more lasting, and I mean, I have a very honest sense of my limitations, because I grew up with a mother who was writing poetry, and I could see I wasn't talented as she was. I was her listener, and I knew that I would never write poetry. I just didn't have that in me. But what I could never aspire to that kind of outlasting time. But what I think one can
your biographies definitely will outlast time. I definitely disagree with that.
No,
I think
it sounds like I'm no, I'm not really. What I wanted to say is that because I feel so really limited, I do revision after revision after revision. This sort of I cling to a line that I think Melville said, that it's always a draft of a draft.
Right.
You know, there's no end to revision. And I remember supervising one of my pupils who was doing a dissertation on Joseph Conrad, and she was very gifted. And she, in fact, followed when I resigned my being a hands-on tutor. She took my post, Susan Jones, and she had been a dancer with the Scottish Ballet until she had an injury and she couldn't go back to ballet. And so she, as it came to St. Hilda's as a mature student, but she had very high, she had a very high standard. She'd already, as a mature student, she knew how to push herself. And I remember thinking, well, her thesis, she's got there already. You know, this is a really first-class thesis on Conrad. And I was prepared to say, okay, let's, submit it now. But she said, no, I've got to do another draft. And that was the push in her. It was published eventually, soon, not too long after after her defense. It was published by OUP, and she's, gone on to all sorts of things. But I'm trying to say, I remember her saying to me, I've got to do another draft, even when I thought it was fine. And I think it's that push of that preparation. And one of the things I thought is flawed in the Oxford education, which is a marvelous education, I wish I'd had it, that tutorial education, which makes a student think before hearing the words from on high. You've got to write, it's the same in Cambridge. I know, because both my daughters read English in Cambridge, and that they have to write their essays before their supervision.
Yeah.
And then you discuss it with your tutor, so that it's really thought out by the student first, and it puts the onus on the student. And I think so. That is a wonderful part of that of the education. But because you write so many essays, I'm talking about the undergraduates, Oxford and Cambridge, because they're writing so many essays so fast through the term, they don't have time for revision. And I don't know how much revision happens in Cambridge, but in Oxford, I don't think they ever did much revision. No. And so when they came to be graduate students, I think that was one hurdle. That they suddenly, I remember when I was supervising graduate students, having to bring them up short, the fact that they can't rush on, that, it has to. I had some very good, I have been the recipient of good advice. And that I was advised early on when I was a graduate student writing the first chapter or two of my dissertation to, I don't know if this is a common image, but I was given this image of an iceberg where 7/8 of the iceberg is underwater. I don't know if that's from, and this man said to me, that's what you've got to aim for. You do all your research, and then you let it sink away under the water, because you're going to actually show only 1/8 of that iceberg of knowledge.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of the phrase, kill your darlings, where you kind of have to and I have massive issues with that when I write my essays, because
Yeah.
I am kind of like a first draft and done kind of person.
Well, that's how you see, but that would be the model for Oxford undergraduate students. They would write as good an essay as they could off the top of their head quickly in a week.
Yeah. And I exactly, and I have so many issues where it's like, you know, you revise it and then like you're over the word count by like a 1,000 words or 500 words, and you're like, I can't cut this out though. It's my favorite sentence, and I've been told like
you can't
kill
tough it out.
your darlings. Exactly.
Yes.
You know?
Yes. So actually, what I've always found, and Daphne, it's never got easier. Although, you know, I've now reached the stage where I've, you know, I've written a few books, few biographies. Each subject will present its own problems, and there's the same need for that absolutely rigorous revision. That man who gave me that iceberg advice said to me, cut every word in your draft that doesn't add something to what you want to say. It was rigorous idea, but it was actually excellent advice. You know, you test every phrase for what it's going to tell. And what I've found, and I don't know if others in like you or your fellow graduates at Cambridge find that it's you can sometimes write your first draft quite fast. Because I sort of close everything in order to get the narrative going. I just write. I'll tell you my process. I have got all my notes from my research.
Okay.
I've got an overall idea of the thesis or the book, and then I actually approach it, of course, chapter by chapter. So the overall is there at the back of my mind, but here is the specific chapter. And I'll read my material 3 times. I promise myself that if I read it 3 times, an idea for the chapter will come to me. And it usually comes before the 3rd time. But you see, if you find the right way to begin a chapter, it will sort of unfold. I remember when I was writing on Emily Dickinson, I came to a chapter and I wasn't, there was a particular chapter where I wasn't sure where the core idea would be. And then I found it in the death of Emily Dickinson's father. I suddenly saw that there was a kind of, he was such a strict puritanical lawyer that once he died, of course they were devastated by his death, but she and her brother, I'm terribly sorry, I've just, I've got to just switch off my phone because somebody's phoning me and I shouldn't. Where I've just found that if I began that chapter with the death of old Mr. Dickinson, Emily Dickinson and her brother were liberated to do things they wouldn't have done while he was alive.
Right.
They did very different things.
Their lives. It was like kind of course. It changed the course of their lives. Yeah.
It changed the course so that they suddenly what they were doing at that stage of their life unfolded in that chapter. I'm just a small instance, but you've almost got to find the core of the chapter before you can start writing. Then my method is to put everything aside. And to me, the narrative momentum is really important. And this is where I feel I diverge from many academics.
Yeah.
And then I get my second draft is that I go back to my notes and then correct it, put in all the detail that's relevant to my narrative, and ensure the accuracy.
Yeah.
And what I found is that, and then there are other revisions, but what is really important, I think, is to accept the fact that revision takes ages and not to get too impatient. It is actually a bit tedious to do it, to get all that accuracy. I used to leave my notes. Now, notes are really important to an academic piece of work and to biography. You've got to show where your facts come from. And of course, people reading biography don't necessarily look at the notes. I often find the notes very interesting. But I used to I was so bored with the idea of having to type out notes that I just would leave it. And then it would be very laborious to put the notes together at the end. So I found that I had to be more patient. My solution now is to be more patient as I'm writing something, research, that I bung in the notes into my second draft.
Yeah, it really is it's a whole process, isn't it? Even for my essays, I find footnote, and I have nowhere near as many notes as proper books. These are just my little essays, you know, and I find notes so tedious to put in. I often put them
tedious
at the end, and then I make a mistake, or I forget one, or, you know, something goes wrong.
Oh, then it can take you ages if you leave it out because you've forgotten where it came from. And gosh, I'm getting so many phone calls. I'm just
don't worry. If you have to take one, you can definitely cut it out. So if feel free to take one, like no worries at all.
No, I'm not going to. No, but what I'm saying is that my method is to put in the full note, the accurate note, in square brackets, and the note's very small. I put it in size 12 so that it's the main thread of the chapter stands out. And then comes the happy moment when I take out the notes and put them into, keep my notes are at the back of the book. I don't know how you have to set out your dissertations in Cambridge, if you can do it at the foot of the page or you do it at the back. But I do the back.
At the foot, which is nice.
You can do the foot, that's nice. I have to do mine at the back, but when you take it out of the text, then you suddenly have a clean text. And that's when you can see what you've done. And I actually have yet another stage. After I feel I've got a clean text for a chapter, I read it aloud because your voice tells you sometimes. I think that there's a lot of rhythm to English.
Oh, definitely.
And then your ear can tell you.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is, I think a lot of us can relate to this very kind of, it really is a process. It's like a labor of love, creating any academic work. It really is.
It is a labor of love. You've got to be in love with it. You've got to be in love with it. You've got to have a subject that fires your thoughts and feelings, you know, and it's no use. I mean, what happened to me last October is that my English agent and my English editor at Virago didn't like my suggestion of what I'd like to do next. And my Virago editor, in fact, rejected it. And what they came up with was their alternatives. And it was very kind of them to offer me ideas and alternatives, but it wasn't in my thoughts and feelings to do what they said.
You have to feel it.
You've got to. I just have thought, no. I didn't absolutely say no to them because I didn't want to be rude, but I'll think about it. But actually, I haven't given it up completely, but I am stubbornly not having a contract, just doing now what I think one must do, what one feels one has to do.
Of course. And I think it really comes through in the writing as well. Like you can see when the person is there, and you can see when the person is like being forced to write an essay for a supervision they're having or something like that. You know? Exactly. And so for my dissertation this past year, I wrote on Kathy Acker, who is this like experimental 1980s novelist from New York. And she writes a lot of really wacky books and really amazing books that are kind of part narrative, part dream journal, part there are sometimes images and sketches in the books, you know.
So it's multi-form.
Yeah, exactly. And we had read her in a seminar, and I was just enthralled. I was like, who is this person? How odd. And her topics are very taboo. So everyone in the seminar was very uncomfortable. And I was like, this is great. Like, she's putting people on edge. Like, I found it fascinating. Everyone was so uncomfortable.
It sounds great.
You know, and so I ended up reading a lot of biographies on her, and I got really accustomed to, like, kind of essentially the art of biography. And like, it really is really interesting to see how different biographers approach their work and approach their biography of the same person.
Yes.
So you have like someone like Chris Kraus did a biography on Kathy Acker, but her biography is very different to the newest one on her called Eat Your Mind by Jason McBride. And I had the pleasure to actually liaise with him and ask him a few questions about her, which is amazing. But it's really interesting seeing, like, kind of, it could be a very factual text-based kind of chronological biography, or it could be kind of a more memoir-based kind of like, who is the essence of this person spiritually or emotionally. And like, there are so many different ways you can go about it.
So many different ways. And you see, I don't think there is, you're speaking directly to what I, what I think, that there's no sort of official biography. There's no, I mean, the marketplace may talk about definitive or full-scale biography, and that's what the marketplace may still want. But I think that's very old-fashioned, and I think that there's no one kind of biography. I mean, every single it's a very subjective genre. You can have all the facts right, and yet you can tell very different kind of stories.
Definitely.
So I don't. I think there could be any number of biographies.
Definitely.
I don't think it should be put off about the fact that there is, it may. I don't know. I wanted to ask you, Daphne, if you think it's more rigid in the American marketplace, where they're more rigid about wanting the big official tome, that will outdo all biographies.
Yeah, I think the chase for, like, this is the comprehensive biography of Henry James. Here it is. Buy it and learn everything about him. He's in the book. Here, take him, and you have him. Like, that kind of idea. I think even the chase towards that is such an interesting like phenomenon, because why would you even want that? Why would you even want to be able to contain all of one person's soul and body of work in this one book? It makes no sense. So I think it's a very weird desire, or like inclination.
And you see, there's no way you can know the whole truth. There is no way. I think biographers should admit that there are gaps everywhere, and that there's no way you can know the whole truth. Even if you wanted to write the whole truth about yourself, you couldn't.
Yeah, so true.
No such thing.
It kind of captures that idea that, like, language can never capture reality entirely, which I think is a fascinating idea, because we study English literature. So like, we should think language can capture reality. Obviously, it's super powerful. Like, that's it. But I think language can both create reality and can also never fully capture it. And I think that relationship is so interesting.
So true. That sounds absolutely right.
Thank you so much. I wanted to ask you a little bit about biography and memoir. I have this amazing quote from Susie Orbach from The Observer that she wrote about you, and I'll just read it out for everyone. So she says about you, a biographer with soul. She reaches into the hearts of those she brings alive for us. She makes the meaning of their lives sing and sweat as she invites us into their experiences, their longings, their struggles, and their disappointments. A fascinating mix between memoir and biography. And I would love to hear a little bit about what you think about the relationship between biography and memoir, because I know you've also written some of your own memoirs about like growing up in Cape Town, and it's called Shared Lives, growing up in 50s Cape Town. So I would love to hear a little bit about how you approach memoir as opposed to biography, and kind of what you think about the relationship between memoir and biography, because I think there sometimes overlap. Like, do you think every good biography should read a little bit like a memoir, or like what is the kind of weird relationship between those two?
Well, when I began to write biography in the 70s, just after being a graduate student, it was almost taboo to use I in academic writing. You know, it was always we, or some very sort of official sounding voice.
Yes.
And I don't agree with that. I think that one could use the subjective I. It was a fear at that time that biography had to be sort of ex cathedra, it had to be authoritative. And so you couldn't, it had to be objective, not subjective. I think biographers now would readily admit that there's a very subjective element to biography, and of course memoir is all subjective. And so I think of the biographer as just another reader, and there could be any number of readers. It's as I said, reading a great writer, you feel this intimate connection, and the fruit of a biography is, comes out of that intimate connection, the way you read this writer. And I think you select for the facts that will fit. I think that there is a subjective selection of facts. I once heard the great biographer Richard Holmes give a lecture, the biographer of Shelley and Coleridge. And he gave a lecture. It was a conference on biography in the 90s, and he was then writing on Coleridge, and it was a 2-volume biography. And he said that, he said lots of things, but one thing that stayed with me is that where you begin a chapter and where you end a chapter are very strong points in the overall picture, and that you choose where you're going to begin and end a chapter. So when I was writing on the feminist Mary Wollstonecraft, many biographers who see her as depressive and see her as a kind of melancholy, she did attempt suicide twice, have a very different view. From my view of Mary Wollstonecraft was of her, I was very influenced by a kind of 3-page biographical essay that Virginia Woolf wrote about Mary Wollstonecraft, which is just marvelous. Virginia Woolf could just write 3 pages and would be better than any biographer, because she just she's just got this genius sense for the heart of the life. So she presented a resilient Mary Wollstonecraft, and I resolved to end each chapter not, say, with the cliffhanger of her tempting suicide and what's going to happen, but rather with the upswing of her coming back from a dark place, because I think that's what made her great. Partly what made her great. Of course, one of her ideas was her resilience against terrible misfortunes in her life and difficulties. But she came back each time with a new phase to her ventures, and she was a very venturesome woman, a kind of model of the venturesome woman. And so I'm trying to say that the shape you give, I thought it was really important to end on that, the chapters on the resilient note, the bravery of coming back from a dark place and saying, I'll do this next.
Yeah, I love that idea of, I think it's such a beautiful, it's almost like kind of you're relating to the author. It's kind of like, I love that idea of how you were saying it's like a subjective thing. It's not it's not the comprehensive history done, and this is it here, objective.
Yes. I must hasten to say, Daphne, that I wouldn't fiddle at all with facts. I enjoy the facts. I enjoy the challenge that you've got to kind of stricture there, that you are in, I mean, that I don't want to say prison. I want to say there's a structure of facts. You can't contravene facts, but within the facts, there is a lot of scope for creating a narrative.
Definitely. And I think like the idea of it's almost like a melding of minds between the biographer and
That's it.
the
I
author,
love
or
your saying that. I love
you
your
know,
saying that, because what's coming to my mind is a marvelous scene in Virginia Woolf's, to my mind, her masterpiece, The Waves, where
yeah,
Bernard, the writer, who's very, I mean, very close to Virginia Woolf's voice, Bernard, the writer, who's summing up at the lives of six figures in The Waves. He says, he's saying, you sitting opposite me, the reader, we're all making this together. I think that's and Virginia Woolf said, echoes that. It's coming back to me in one of her essays where she says, let books be an equal creation between us.
yeah.
Isn't that wonderful?
It's
I mean, it's
beautiful.
very generous to the reader, because one can't be. Her language is so wonderful. Her conception of life is so, unreachable. That it's not
No,
true,
yeah,
but it's a wonderful invitation to enter into relations.
it really makes me think that you're almost learning a little bit about the biographer and the biographer's soul as well, like through the book. Like you're learning about, it's almost like you're learning about this person through the lens of how they touched the biographer.
That is it.
You know,
You've got it. You've got it. That's
like
it.
I
That's
think
it.
that is so beautiful.
And so you see, it's not such a huge leap to memoir. I
Yeah.
mean, what memoir, it was such pleasure writing memoir, and I'm writing for the memoir now for the third time. Because there's a certain pleasure in letting go. You don't have to have the notes. You've got more freedom as writing memoir.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I feel that I've got to have some kind of inner check that I do want to tell something as close to the truth as I can read. On the other hand, there's certain things that are red lines for me. In memoir, I don't want to do, I don't know if I can find the right word, something confessional that is sort of like tearing my heart out. I want it to be, I want there to be refined control. I mean, I think that every work has to have form, and one's got to find the form. And I think in the same way, there are controls on biography. I mean, it's a big question how far you should go into the life. I don't, what I have had a kind of principle with myself that one must do justice to greatness, even as in the case of the papers of Emily Hale. I mean, the Eliot's letters to Emily Hale, which show Eliot in a less than lovable light. I mean, there are some very great letters to Emily Hale, and I understand why she was in love with him, in love with the man who wrote such extraordinary, some very extraordinary letters. But at the same time, they do show a dark side, a more flawed side to Eliot from a woman's point of view, a very misogynist side. And so I mean, this dilemma was with me all the time. I was reading through those 1,131 letters he wrote to this woman for decades. How am I going to deal with this? But there was a clear principle, which had been my principle before, that one must do justice to greatness, so that even if you are showing a great writer's flaws, as you do have to do if you're going to be truthful.
Right.
I don't hold with the Eliot estates. I'm surmising this, but I think there's an Eliot estate that does want to protect Eliot. Understand their point of view. They want to protect Eliot and they don't want anything questionable to come out, or they're trying to ward it off. So that's something really betraying he did to Emily Hale, which was to write a letter to posterity saying that she would have destroyed him as a poet. No, the absolute opposite was true, that she was his Beatrice to, like Beatrice to Dante.
Exactly.
He cast Beatrice as that Beatrice figure when, the Hyacinth Girl. It was very much at the heart of what I was writing.
Yeah.
There was this dilemma what to do.
Yeah,
because
that is
his greatness as well, you see.
Yeah, I've never thought of that before. Like, what do biographers do when
what do you do?
They admire the person they're writing about, but like everyone, because they are a person, even though they're an amazing author, like everyone, that author is a flawed person. Like, are we all? They all have their good and dark.
And that's why when we have, one has to actually wrestle with this. And I remember in that, coming back to that, my interview with Humphrey Carpenter as a biographer, he was writing an essay on biography, and I was really just asking him questions. And he was short questions, and he was providing all the material in his answers. But I did ask him, I said, when it came to Benjamin Britten, not that I know much about that musician, but I said, what do you think the biographer should expose Benjamin Britten's predilection for little boys? I mean, pedophilia. It's a very dark area. And Humphrey's answer was absolutely loud and clear that you can't hide it. He said that it's too closely connected. He said, I can't explain this to you, but he said to me, it's closely connected with his art.
Yes, that is so interesting.
So that is, he, on the other hand, I must hasten to say, I do not hold with expose. I do not want a biography to be all expose.
Or like a shock factor, like shock, this chapter, shock, like constantly exposing things. Yeah.
Yes, I would not do that, because I think greatness has to be acknowledged.
Yeah, definitely.
And
definitely.
I do think that compassion is called for. I mean, as far as compassion can take you, you have to try and understand why people did certain things. I mean, it's a great moral question in justice. I mean, do you try to understand why a murderer committed murder and excuse him, or do you say, no, this is unacceptable from the point of view of the victim? It's a deep moral question.
It's really interesting because you have to somehow factor all those questions in and think about them through language, because language is kind of, language sometimes is a little bit absolute. Like what, you can't have, like, as we were talking about drafts, you can't release like 6 versions of your biography and be like, let's see, so you have to really think about that. Yeah.
You're so right. And it is language, because if I think of the revision upon revision that I did together with my editor, Lenny Goodings, for The Hyacinth Girl, she was very severe, and she cut a lot every day. We went through the text 3 times. She was a very hands-on editor. And it was all through all those, my own drafts, and then with those sittings with my editor, there was this struggle to tune language all the time to try and get it as close, as right as possible.
Yeah. It almost reminds me.
Absolutely right. It won't be, but try and get it as right as possible.
Yeah. I was going to say, it almost reminds me a little bit of like translation and like the act of a translator.
Yes, interesting.
Right?
Yes, it's like it's got to be as right as possible.
Yeah, it's like the biographer is almost a kind of translator, and they're trying to translate this person into language rather than one text into another text. You're actually translating a person into language.
That's it's a real insight. Fascinating. You could write something very interesting, Daphne, about biography as translation.
Yeah,
Wow.
I have an idea now.
I'm very impressed with that idea.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it really is. I think this idea of getting as close as possible to
Yes,
X thing or idea or entity,
yes,
it really is interesting because I also think of translation. How I was saying earlier about the biographer puts a little piece of their own soul and their own how they
yes,
think of this person into their work. I think as does the translator. I think depending on how they read that person is how
yes.
they're going to translate it, you
That
know?
is so. That is so. Now, I remember something that an editor said to me at one point. I was Jenny Uglow, who's an admirable biographer, um, was my editor. This is in the late 90s. And she said to me rather reprovingly, I don't think a biographer should have passages of speculation. Now, that is a question. Jenny Uglow was being more purist and saying, no, just stick to the facts, just tell it. I can't remember her exact words. This was said
Oh yeah.
orally to me. But I was then writing on Henry James, and I was feeling very speculative about James's relation to two particular American women, Minnie Temple and a writer, Constance Fenimore Wilson, whom he called Fenimore because she was a great niece of James Fenimore Cooper. And I was seeing Henry James, it was a bit like the method of the Heisen girl, seeing Henry James and his greatness through his relationships with these two women who did inspire works.
Right.
He drew on them for his work, as well as had serious relationships with them. Not relationships that I mean, interestingly, they weren't relationships that fell into any accepted slot. They were,
Right.
they weren't lovers. They weren't,
Right.
but they were more than friends.
Right. Yeah.
They were muses in a way, but
Yeah.
not muses in the dreamy sense,
Yeah.
silly.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to.
I think
I'm sort of lost
oh,
it.
you were feeling speculative. Why?
Yes. So Jenny Hugler said to me, she thought I shouldn't indulge. I mean,
Yeah.
the implication, she didn't use as harsh a word as indulge. She was very tactful, but she was saying that for the biographer to be as subjective as I was being in that biography of James, that I was allowing myself passages of speculation. I'm not sure that what the answer is. It's to be debated, Daphne. How much,
Yeah.
one can allow oneself. Obviously, you don't want the biographer to be intruding too much on the narrative. On the other hand, I would probably welcome more of the biographer's subjective. You see, I think that I remember discussing this. There is a biography, or there was, I haven't followed what happens in Oxford, but there used to be a special option for Oxford finals in biography run by Hermione Lee. And that developed into a biography a place in Oxford, but she asked me, Hermione Lee, to come when she started out with this option in the early 2000s. She didn't have people to teach it. So she asked, it was a new option, and she asked established biographers to come and do a lecture to the final year students on some subject of his or her choice. And I remember I was the second or third person to come and lecture to the students, and the students there pressed me about just this issue of
Speculation.
of how you can, of, I think that we called it imaginative truth versus factual truth.
Yeah.
And they pressed me quite hard, the students. And what I think, I had by then written a biography of Charlotte Bronte, where I first had the idea of the importance of imaginative truth. And I think that what I said to myself while I was writing that biography is that I was aware of the gaps, although there are a lot of facts about Charlotte Bronte, and any number of people can write great tomes about Charlotte Bronte. I still thought that there were gaps.
Yeah.
I can give you an example, but I won't digress too much, where we don't know the facts. And I think that it's all right, so long as you make your reader aware that it is not factual truth, but imaginative truth. So that you say to the reader, here I'm stopping with the succession of factual truth, and I'm going to guess something, and we can't be certain.
Yeah.
It was somehow accepted what I did with Charlotte Bronte. The biography I wrote after that on Emily Dickinson, it was treated by readers as much, in America anyway, as more iffy, because I speculated about evidence. There was circumstantial evidence. I put it all together in just one chapter, where Emily Dickinson was secluded because she had epilepsy. Now, I couldn't say for sure, there's no proof that she had epilepsy, but it would have explained a lot of things because there was no epilepsy or no control of it in her time. And I went so far as I went to an archive in Boston, the medical school archive in Boston, and I found really interesting material from a doctor that Emily, a very high level Boston doctor, whom Emily Hale's father took her to see when she was 20 years old. And one of his specialities was epilepsy. He was somebody people consulted as an authority when everything else failed, when people didn't know what the illness was. Anyway, I can't say he was a specialist on other things as well. So I won't say because he had 8 specialities, epilepsy was one of them. But I put it together with quotes from Emily Dickinson's poems that were very suggestive.
It almost makes me think a bit of like detective work. Like you're kind of like a detective.
Yes, that's another excellent idea, because biography is detection. And I love that aspect of biography. I love going to an archive as a detective and knowing what I have to find. And one other method I have, and it's worked especially with Henry James, is to go initially to the archive, get your material, and begin writing. And then go back to the archive at later stages, because as you move on, you discover what you need to know. So it was very fertile with Henry James for me to look at various, there were loads of unseen letters at Harvard. So I went to look at certain collections of letters, the nieces of Minnie Temple, who had mattered to him imaginatively very much, and she had died young. And he had taken possession of her when she died young. He actually is explicit in a letter to his mother, to Mrs. James. Now she'll live forever in the crystal walls of the past. And he would know her, and she'll become his model for the American girl abroad. Well, she never went abroad, but he was going to take her abroad, imagine. That was just a wonderful idea. But he treated Minnie's nieces in a certain way that was almost an offshoot of his relation with Minnie Temple. And I remember in the late stages of that biography going to look at his correspondence with one niece in particular, who was an artist, American artist, and he anyway, it sort of helped that imaginative truth side.
It's like the whole process of trying to uncover and
to get and look for clues. And you've got to actually, there's no way to train somebody to do that. I remember Humphrey Carpenter, I seem to be coming back to him and that interview a lot, but he started off the interview, saying in a sort of laughingly shameless way of the upper classes in England, he was saying, look, my mother loved to rummage in people's bottom drawers because she was so curious. And I'm just like her. I just rummage in people's bottom drawers. He just said, I'm shamelessly curious.
So sorry. I think someone just called me. That was very strange. My phone's on do not disturb. No, that is very curious. I love that. I think it really is a kind of love of curiosity and a labor of curiosity. I'm so sorry.
And I think that was something another biographer, Janet Malcolm, said about her own investigations. She said there can be morally, what journalists do, and I think this applies to biographers too, can be, I'm quoting her, morally indefensible. That's how I began my lecture for Hermione Lee's biography course. That I remember now, it's coming back to me. It was about 2002, but I opened with a quote from Janet Malcolm saying, "What we do is morally indefensible."
Wow. Yeah, I love that.
But you know, we do it, even though it's morally.
I think it's such an interesting art and form in literature that's kind of like half detective work, half curiosity, many halves, half detective work, half curiosity, half translation, half memoir, half act of love, half fact. Like it's all this put together, and I think it's fascinating. Like it genuinely is.
Yes.
Yeah, so I want to say first, like before we close, I want to say thank you so much for joining me today. I learned so much. It was absolutely fascinating. It was so interesting.
My pleasure, Daphne. You asked such interesting questions. And I think I really wish you well with your idea of biography as translation.
Thank you. I want to ask, as a kind of closing question, it's a question we have to ask. We need the answer to it. What is your favorite biography that you've written? What was your favorite to write?
I do perhaps think it was the book that I think of as my orphan, because it did badly and it did worst in the marketplace. It was that I loved writing on Henry James. There was such a wealth of the inner life. It felt to me a perfect subject to explore. And I can't help it that, you know, it's out of your hands once it's in the hands of publishers, what they decide to do with it. So, but I just loved the 5 or so years I spent exploring, and there was such rich material. And I was fascinated by the 2 women who, you know, who were inspirations for him.
His muses.
Yes.
Yeah. That is amazing. Amazing. Henry James. That's a great, I think that's a great answer. And that's a great way to kind of end our conversation. And again, I want to say thank you so much. I think like you're an absolute like amazing literary figure, and you understand so much of people's inner lives, inner thoughts, and that relationship to language, which I think is the really interesting, crucial part.
That is another very interesting thing, and very hard to define. Yes.
Yeah. Like it's very difficult to to define and to pinpoint how are we translating life into language? Why is language significant? Why do we use language? How is that tool?
Unless we get it right, there's nothing.
Exactly. And I love what you were saying about how greatness needs to be recognized, you know, and when you have an amazing author, you need to give kind of justice to that and like give respect to that. That's amazing.
Thank you so much, Daphne. It's been my pleasure talking to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I hope you have a great end of your evening, or you know, I guess beginning of evening. It's so light outside now that daylight savings. But yeah, I was so lovely, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. And yeah, thank you.
Wish you too, Daphne. I hope we meet someday. It would be
definitely yes, definitely
this talk.
Definitely yes. Thank you so much.
Bye.